And at this time, the court reporter, Missy Leonetti, will swear in the witness.
Would you raise your right hand? Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Give your name for the record, if you will.
James Vaughn?
Do you go by Jim?
Yes.
Where do you work, Mr. Vaughn?
Joseph Ileto Transfer.
And how long have you worked at Joseph Ileto Transfer?
About 37 years?
And Joseph Ileto Transfer is a trucking company, right?
Yes.
You're a director at Ileto, isn't that right?
Operations Director.
Have you also been called the safety director?
It's under the responsibilities of the Operations Director.
So that's among your responsibilities?
Yes.
What do you do as the safety director?
You mean as the Operations Director?
Well, sure. What are your responsibilities associated with your duties as the safety director, which I understand is part of being the operations manager, or operations director, excuse me?
Okay, so I work in the corporate office in New York, communicate with our operations managers throughout the country on various issues, whether it's safety, operational issues, home delivery issues, tractor-trailer issues, customer relations.
You also have some responsibility for risk management, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us what risk management is.
Well, I work with the insurance companies, and in addition to that, my office and my group is responsible for vetting any new employees, background checks.
And you get involved when an Ileto truck has been in a crash, right?
Yes, I would be involved with that as well.
Okay. At the time of this collision, tell us how many trucks Ileto owned or operated.
That would be August of 2015, I believe.
September 3 of 2015.
Okay. Say around 300.
And Ileto operated in 30 states or so, is that right?
We had offices in 18 states. Some of our trucks traveled through several other states.
Would it be accurate to say that Ileto operates through offices located in 15 states and had a service reach extending beyond 35 states?
Yes.
You said your office was in New York?
Yes.
In the city or here on Long Island?
On Long Island.
And do you live here on Long Island?
Yes.
We are here in Long Island taking this deposition today, right?
Yes.
Have you given a deposition before?
Yes.
How many times?
Half a dozen or so.
Is that all in connection with your work with Ileto?
Yes.
All in connection with crashes involving Ileto trucks?
Yes.
I want to ask you about some responses that Ileto gave to the written questions that we've exchanged in this case. You've probably heard of interrogatories before.
Yes.
All right, I'll show you now what I'll mark as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 6. To your deposition, and I'll represent to you that this is a copy of Ileto's interrogatory responses in this case. And as you probably already can figure out, what happens here is that the plaintiff, that is my client, asks a question in the regular font, and then the bold below that is going to be Ileto's answer. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Turn with me, if you will, to page 9 and interrogatory number 22. You'll find it highlighted there. And that says, the question was, does Joseph Ileto Transfer Inc. accept any responsibility for the wreck? And the answer was no. Did I read that right?
You read that right, yes.
Do you stand by that?
Go ahead. No,
All right, why not?
because this individual who had the accident was operating under our authority, and therefore we were responsible.
Okay. Does Ileto accept responsibility for Mr. Jordan's medical bills arising out of this collision?
Objection. Calls for a legal conclusion.
I believe you can go ahead and answer.
I couldn't answer that question. I wouldn't know the answer to it.
Okay. Well, do you know whether Eletto accepts responsibility for Mr. Jordan's pain and suffering caused by this collision?
Objection. Calls for a legal conclusion.
I'm not an attorney.
Do you know?
No.
Do you know whether Eletto accepts responsibility for the changes to Mr. Jordan's life that have been caused by his injuries as a result of this collision?
Same objection.
Again, no.
No, you don't know?
No, I don't know.
Well, was the driver of this truck at fault for the collision?
Our driver?
Yes.
I'm not sure who was at fault at the time of the accident.
You don't know who was at fault?
That's correct.
Now, this collision, I think we've said, occurred on September the 3rd of 2015. It's now March of 2017, and you still don't know who's at fault for the collision.
I mean, I wasn't there, so I didn't see it happen.
Well, you investigated the collision, right?
My folks in Stone Mountain did, yes.
And you were in charge of investigating the collision, weren't you?
No, the folks in Atlanta on scene would have investigated the collision. I would have received the documents, the accident report, and forwarded it on to the insurance company.
Well, take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 6, which is the interrogatory responses that are in front of you there. And turn with me to interrogatory number 7, which starts on page 3. And I won't read the full paragraph under the number 7 there, but it basically says identify people that have the positions described below. And flip then to the next page, number 4, and look at letter J, which is highlighted there. It says persons who investigated this collision, Jim Vaughn. Did I read that right?
You did.
All right. And in the days after this collision, you were trying to figure out what happened and investigating it, weren't you?
After the collision, the responsibility is for the local manager to complete an accident report, forward it to our office in New York. We take a look at it and then forward it to Van Liner.
Well, I'll just go ahead and show you the document then. I'll show you what I'm going to mark as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 7, which your company has produced or given to us in this case. This Plaintiff's Exhibit 7 appears to be an email exchange, right?
Yes.
And if you, it's only a 2-page exhibit. If you flip to the second page, we see an email from you, right?
Yes.
And that email is dated September 10, 2015, right?
Yes.
It sounds like that'd be 7 days after the collision, right?
Yes.
In fact, the subject is September 3, 2015 accident, right?
Correct.
This says that, who's this email to?
Katie Booth,
And who is she?
I believe she works for Van Liner.
Van Liner Insurance Company, a defendant in this case?
That's correct.
And here, you said in this email that you had just spoken with Antoine Billings, right?
Yes.
And Billings is the name of the driver who collided with Mr. Jordan, isn't it?
Yes.
And you went on to describe what happened in the collision, right?
Yes.
Here you say he was, you talked about a citation in the case, correct?
Yes.
And then it goes on, and you have some language here. We don't have to go through all of it, but it refers to an IV and an OV. And I want to ask you what those mean. What does IV mean?
Insured vehicle.
So that'd be the Eletto truck, right?
That's correct.
And OV, that'd be, is that other vehicle?
That's correct.
And that'd be the collision that, the vehicle that Mr. Jordan was pinned against in this case, I guess.
That would be the other vehicle.
Right. And this talks about how the Eletto driver had his foot slip off the brake, hit the other vehicle driver whose arm was pinned between the truck and may have sustained a fracture. Is all that correct?
Yes.
Now, I asked you earlier who was at fault for the collision, and you've answered, so I won't ask you again. But I will ask you this. Do you have any reason to think that Mr. Jordan bears any fault for this collision?
Object to the form calls for a legal conclusion, but go ahead.
We still don't understand why he would have gotten out of his truck in the lane of traffic and gone by behind his truck to check a load, why he wouldn't have pulled off into a parking lot to do that. So we find that kind of unusual.
So
That's not something that normally truck drivers would do in traffic.
do you think Mr. Jordan is at fault for doing that?
Object to the form. Go ahead.
I would say he made a poor decision to check his load in a traffic lane.
Well, what evidence do you know of that suggests that Mr. Jordan is at fault for the collision?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion. Subject to that, if you can answer, go ahead.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, did you learn something from the police officers who investigated the case, suggesting to you that Mr. Jordan was at fault?
No.
Did you learn something from the medical records, suggesting that Mr. Jordan was at fault?
No.
The truth is, Mr. Vaughn, to the best of your knowledge, you don't know of any evidence held by any defendant suggesting that Mr. Jordan was at fault for this collision. Isn't that true?
If you can answer, go ahead.
Only that his actions were unusual.
Well, let me show you a document that I'll mark as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 8. Have you heard of requests for admissions? It's kind of like interrogatories that we went over a minute ago.
Yes.
All right, that's what I'm going to show you. These are requests for admissions in the case that your company has answered. And it works much like the interrogatories. There's a number and then a statement made by my client through me, and then your company either admits or denies or responds. And there's two responses here because there was an initial response, and then earlier this month they changed the response, and that's called an amended response here. I want to ask you to flip to the second page of Plaintiff Exhibit 8, and it has 39 at the top. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the statement is, plaintiff was not at fault for the collision. Did I read that right?
You read that right.
The initial response there says deny, right?
Yes.
And then under that, there's an amended response, some of which is highlighted, and that says, quote, for its amended response to request to admit number 39, defendant Ileto states that based on the information presently available, it does not have any evidence showing plaintiff was at fault for the collision. As such, defendant Ileto admits in part, denies as written in part, request to admit number 39. Did I read that right?
You read that right.
And that's dated March 15th, correct?
Correct.
That had been last week, I think.
Correct.
I want to show you a picture that I've now marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 9. Have you seen that before?
No, sir.
Well, would you be surprised to learn that that's a picture of the Ileto truck and the crane between which Mr. Jordan was pinned?
Surprised?
Yeah. Would you be surprised to learn that?
No.
Any reason to dispute that?
No.
Do you see that little dent on the bumper of the truck?
Yes.
Would you be surprised to learn that's where Mr. Jordan was pinned?
Yes.
You would be surprised to learn that.
Yeah, based on this picture, I would be.
Why would you be surprised to learn that?
Well, looking at this picture, the crease in the bumper appears to be previous to the accident because it looks like there's some rust there.
Now, did you speak with the officer who investigated this wreck on the scene?
No.
You know, have you ever tried to make contact with Officer Peevler?
No,
I'm sorry, Officer.
Peevler, that's Peavler. Have you spoken with the medical first responders who came to the scene of this collision?
no,
Have you spoken with anyone who was on the scene of this collision when it happened other than Eleto's driver?
no.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you have any reason to believe that a mechanical or maintenance problem with the Eleto truck contributed to this collision?
No.
How many times did you speak with Mr. Billings, the driver of the Eleto truck?
I can't recall specifically, maybe 2 or 3 times.
All right. Did he ever mention any mechanical or maintenance problem on the truck to you?
No,
Well, did you know, and when we say you spoke with Mr. Billings 2 or 3 times, I'm talking about speaking to him about the wreck after the wreck. Is that what you understood my question to be?
post-accident,
Right.
yes.
Okay. Did you know that once this legal case got started, Mr. Billings suggested that the brake pedal was worn, and that's why his foot slipped off of it?
I heard that.
Who did you hear that from?
Mr. Billings,
Oh, so when did he say that?
can't recall.
Okay. Well, it wasn't in your initial conversation with him, was it?
Again, I don't know which conversation it was specifically.
Well, let's look back at that email that you sent, and I misplaced my copy of it. I believe it was exhibit number 7. And your email to Ms. Booth with Vanliner doesn't say anything about the brake pedal being worn, does it?
No, sir.
And this email was after your first conversation with Mr. Billings anyway, right?
I would imagine.
Well, it has to be, because the email says, I just spoke with Antoine Billings, right?
Okay, yes.
Isn't it true that Eleto, your company, was not aware of any issue with that brake pedal?
I'm not aware of any issue with that brake pedal. I don't know that anybody else in the organization was.
Well, has anyone else in the organization, to your knowledge, thought that there might be a mechanical problem with the brake pedal?
No.
And consistent with that, I'd like to ask you to pull out those interrogatories again. They're plans exhibit number 6, and flip to page 12. And you can see where I'm going because it's highlighted there. You see 31 in the middle of the page?
Yes.
And the question there was, did any issue with the subject truck, whether a mechanical problem, electronic problem, or defect, cause or contribute to the wreck in any way? If so, describe that issue in detail. And the answer was,
If so, describe.
let me start it over again. And that interrogatory says, quote, did any issue with the subject truck, whether a mechanical problem, electronic problem, or defect, cause or contribute to the wreck in any way? If so, describe that issue in detail, end quote, and the answer was, quote, not to this defendant's knowledge, end quote. Is that right?
That's correct.
Isn't it also true that after this collision, Mr. Billings did not take the truck in for repairs, but instead kept driving and making his deliveries?
What time did the accident occur?
About 12:30.
So his day would have been done by 4, so I believe after the accident, he may have continued with his deliveries. I can't say for sure. That's all I know about that.
Well, have you looked at the GPS vehicle tracking to figure out what happened after the collision?
No, I personally have not, no.
Well, let me show you then what I'll mark as plaintiff's exhibit number 10 to your deposition. And I'll represent to you that this was produced by Ryder, the company from whom Eletto got the truck. You see that Ryder 0036 stamp in the bottom right?
Yes,
And then at the top left, it says Ride Smart, correct?
yes.
All right. Well, this exhibit has a whole bunch of pages, almost 30. And it goes through, I'll just represent to you, September 2nd at midnight through the end of September 4th, but we're not interested in all that. If you'll flip with me to page 16 of 29, tell me when you're there.
I'm here.
Now, there's you can see on the right, there's a list of the approximate GPS location, and do you see the third one down, which is highlighted there, says 5993 Peachtree Parkway Northwest.
Yes,
You see that?
yes.
Do you understand that to be at or near the site of the collision?
I don't, but
Any reason to dispute that?
no.
And then if we go all the way left, we'll see the date and time is September 3, 2015, date of the collision, at about 12:34 p.m. Do you see that?
Yes,
Now, if we look down after that, we can see that the truck keeps going. It's all through September 3rd to the end of the day. It goes on for several pages. The truck is still out, moving around, and apparently making deliveries. Does that appear to be correct?
yes.
And we can see if we flip to page 23 of 29, looking at the fifth line down, the truck continued moving around until a little after 10 o'clock p.m. on the night of September 3rd, 2015. Is that right?
Yes,
Isn't it true that drivers are supposed to make daily inspections of the trucks that they drive?
yes,
And they're supposed to create something called vehicle inspection reports, right?
yes,
That's required by federal law, right?
yes,
And then it's also something that Eletto tells its drivers they're supposed to do, correct?
yes.
And we'll show you an exhibit about that. This will be plaintiff's exhibit number 11. And plaintiff's exhibit 11 is some of Eletto's training materials, right?
This is part of the driver qualification file.
Is this part of the training materials that Eletto uses?
It's part of the driver qualification file.
Tell me what you mean by that then.
When a driver is hired, there's several documents that he completes, and this would be one of them.
This is one that Antoine Billings created, apparently from the date on the bottom, about a week before the collision on August 25th of 2015.
Correct, that's probably the day he started completing the DQF.
Driver qualification file.
Yes,
And if we look there at the top, I've highlighted what I'm interested in. It says every driver must prepare a vehicle inspection report in writing at the completion of each day's work on each vehicle he or she operates. Is that right?
yes,
And that vehicle inspection report is supposed to cover several things, but the very first one listed is the service brakes, right?
yes,
Service brakes just means what most drivers would call the regular brakes, the one you hit with your foot if you want to stop, right?
yes.
Now, where is the driver inspection report for the day of this collision?
I have no idea.
Well, have you looked for it?
I personally have not looked. Maybe the staff in Stone Mountain might have. And had they found it, I would have produced it, but apparently they didn't.
Did you call down there and ask the folks in Stone Mountain?
I probably did.
Do you remember whether you did that?
No, I don't.
Have you ever seen the vehicle inspection report for the subject truck, that is Billings' truck, on the day of this collision?
I have not.
Well, did you know that Mr. Jordan, through his lawyer, which is me, asked to see that document?
If you say so.
You didn't know that, though?
I don't recall, no.
Okay. Well, I'll show you then what I'll mark as Plans Exhibit number 12. And this is going to be an excerpt from requests for productions, which are a lot like the ROGs and the interrogatories and RFAs that we've been over. Are you familiar with the idea of requests for production?
Yes.
And look, if you flip to the second page of Plans Exhibit 12, which was page 9 to the original longer document, you see 23 at the bottom highlighted there.
Yes.
And that says, produce all post-trip inspection reports or forms for the subject truck from the day of the wreck and the 7 days preceding the wreck. And the answer was, this defendant is not in possession of records responsive to this paragraph. Did I read that right?
You did.
And then on the very next page, number 24 asks for pre-trip inspection reports, and the answer is the same. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you know that your company's lawyers in this case have said they don't know whether Billings ever created that vehicle inspection report that federal law required?
I don't.
Well, I'll show you then what I've marked as Plans Exhibit number 13. And this is a letter, and at the top it says Dennis, Corey, Porter, and Smith, right?
Yes.
That's the law firm that's defending this case on Eletto and Van Liner and Billings' behalf, right?
Yes.
And if we flip to the second page, you can see what I'm driving at here. Number 3, which is highlighted, it says, Billings is not sure whether he prepared a pre-trip or post-trip inspection report. As stated, defendants are not in possession of documents responsive to those paragraphs. Did I read that right?
You did.
Now, isn't it true, Mr. Vaughn, that shortly after this collision, Eletto knew, and you knew, that that vehicle inspection report was an important document to save?
We understand that we're responsible to gather the documents required, especially in light of an accident, yes.
And that included specifically the vehicle inspection report, right?
Yes.
In fact, you received a letter, well, I guess I'll just mark it. You received a letter shortly after this wreck asking you and your company to preserve that vehicle inspection report, right?
You can show it to me?
I can, sure. Do you remember it?
No.
All right. Then I'll show you what I've marked as Plans Exhibit 14. And this is a letter from the Mabra firm, right? It says at the top.
Yes.
Is to Joseph Eletto and to your attention, right?
Yes.
And then it goes on in here, the highlighted language toward the bottom of the first page of Plans Exhibit 14 asks that certain evidence be preserved and not to be destroyed, modified, altered, repaired, or changed in any manner. Is that right?
Yes.
And then number 5 on the list of stuff to preserve includes the inspection reports, correct?
Yes.
Now, did you look for those inspection reports today in advance of this deposition?
No.
When was the last time you looked for them?
I personally never looked for them.
Okay.
I see this letter was sent to our Hicksville address. Well, we're in Syosset, and we were at Syosset at the time. I don't even recall ever seeing this letter. I may have, but I don't.
Well, anyway, there was a legal requirement to preserve that stuff, wasn't there?
Understood.
Isn't it true, Mr. Vaughn, that Antoine Billings, the driver of this truck, was not very experienced at driving trucks like this?
I don't recall his exact experience. I'm sure that was discussed when he was interviewed locally.
I'll circle back to that in a minute. This was a commercial truck that Eletto leased to Billings to drive, right?
Yes.
And at the time of this collision, Billings had just started driving for Ileto like a week or two before, isn't that right?
I believe it was his first day.
Okay. And before he started driving for Ileto, isn't it true that Mr. Billings had been driving for Pizza Hut?
I'd have to look at some documents to verify that.
Do you remember him being a Pizza Hut delivery driver?
I personally don't know.
All right, well, I'll show you then what I've marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 15. And 15 is an excerpt from some materials produced to us in this case. And there at the top, under last job, it says Pizza Hut and position was delivery driver, right?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Billings did not have a commercial driver's license, did he?
No.
And we'll show you what I've marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit number 16. And I'll represent to you that's a copy of Mr. Billings' driver's license produced to Mr. Jordan and his lawyers in this case. Do you see the stamp there, Ileto 000026 in the bottom right?
Yes.
Have you seen this driver's license before?
I'm sure I have.
Well, have you seen the other driver's licenses for Mr. Billings?
No.
This one was no good on the date of the collision, was it?
Objective form.
If you look in the top right there, it says this driver's license expired on August 20 of 2015. Isn't that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. I have no further questions.
No questions.
This is the end of today's deposition. The time is 12:58. We're off the record.